And welcome back, wrestling fans, to episode 124 of the Rudis Wrestling Podcast, along with Matt Dernlan in the Rudis HQ. I'm Jason Bryant here from sunny but chilly New Brighton, Minnesota, as we head in to the final week of the Division I college wrestling season. And Matt, as a head coach, there are some things that annoyed you. One of those things that annoys you, that annoyed me, that annoyed fans, that annoys pretty much everybody, because there is no perfect solution, is college wrestling rankings. We have dual meet polls. We have tournament rankings. We have about 9,000 individual rankings based on whichever outlet you're looking at this week. And as the coaches panel rankings and the RPI and the qualification process is coming to a head, those allocations get released on February 27th. All of these things come into a factor when you, as a former head coach, sat down to do a coaches panel ranking, and it drives everybody bonkers.
Well, I think it all comes down to continuity and consistency, right? When you have 10 different rankings, 10 different polls, and I'm gonna let you actually break down, because there's a point of differentiation between a poll and a rank, right? You know that much better than I do. You've explained it to the point where I wasn't even familiar with how some of these things were broken down. So, one, where do I look to? What's the most legitimate, respected, most thorough, accurate ranking? Because, and what's the one outside of the college ranking poll is the most recognized, or what should be the most standardized or respected poll out there? Like, there's so many things to unpack with this that it just gets confusing. I don't even know. And as a former college coach, I probably have a better pulse on this than most people, and it even confused me. So for the general fan, for the spectator, for the follower of a certain program, I don't even know where they would look. And typically, I think what most programs do, there's a program bias. Like, okay, if there's 10 different polls out there, if I'm the SID for the program, I'm going to scan the 10 different polls. And if I'm 10 here and 15 here, I'm going to go with the highest ranking. But it may not be accurate. I mean, you go through the updated dual rankings this weekend, and there's so much. I mean, there's disparity all over the board. There's teams that beat other teams this week, and they're still ranked ahead of them, or they lost, but they're still ranked ahead. I mean, those things boggle my mind. So I'm going to turn this over to you and let you just take the floor and run and break this down. I guess break it down so we have a better fundamental understanding of what's the difference between a poll and a ranking and all the different things.
All right, so just to give you a backstory, one, I worked in the newspaper industry for 8 years. I started as a phone snagger days after my 17th birthday in Newport News, Virginia, at the Daily Press. So I've been associated with Associated Press and Tribune newspapers for a while. So I got to get on the AP wire. I saw the votes coming in. I saw each week, AP top 25 in basketball and football. When I got into wrestling, I brought a lot of those things to it. The coaches poll, for example, is something I've facilitated for the NWCA since I was an employee there from 2005 to 2008. Now, there's a couple years I didn't do it, but that's one of the freelance contract positions I have with them, is I will coordinate the polls, send out the ballots, do all the results, send them out each week, and then the coaches will vote, send in their top 25. I'll compile them, put them together, and again, no editorial oversight. If that's the results come out, that's where they are. If a coach doesn't look at a result or ranks a team too high, there is a situation where if there's an anomaly where a team is ranked 5th and everybody else has them 20th, maybe somebody just fat-fingered something, and I'll send a note out to that coach like, hey, did you mean this? That is the only time I actually inject myself into the process. So that is how it's done, 25-1. If you're a first-place team, you get 25 points. If you're a 25th place team, you get 1 point. That is how the coaches poll is conducted, and it is the only poll of rankings in wrestling because it is the only one that surveys or sends out ballots to coaches, and then all those numbers are put into a situation. Whereas Flo has a pretty good dual meet ranking. I'll give Kyle Brackey the credit there because that would be, I look at that ranking, for example, like that's how I would have voted this week, for example. I wish some of the coaches would pay a little bit more attention in that regard. In the end, that's out of my hands. I can only give them so much information. What they do with it is up to them. Now, so that's the poll. A ranking, typically on the individual side of things, is done essentially by one, maybe two people for an outlet. We hear people say, oh, the polls, the polls, the polls. Well, they're not actually polls. They're just rankings. And then not to be confused with computer things like Seton Hall Pirate and WrestleStat do on their own time. Those are ratings, more or less. Now, there is a ranking of a rating. So, again, semantics. But a poll and a ranking aren't the same thing. They cannot be used interchangeably both ways. Although a poll can be a ranking is not always a poll. That boredom out of the way, individual rankings, having spent time at Intermat and then the conglomerate and amateur wrestling news and the open mat when they were working together. I've been on college rankings panels and high school rankings panels since I was 17 years old. So I understand there's a methodology, and everybody's methodology differs. There was a bit of a discussion a couple weeks ago after the Austin DeSanto default. Does that match count? Should Roman Bravo Young get the benefit of the doubt? He was winning the match, but the match was terminated early because of injury. Should that count? Some ranking services decided to use that. Flow did not. So that is a difference in methodology, which again is a subjective thing. It's you stick with that. That's how it is. So that's how Flow's rankings are done. Intermat, the Open Mat, Amateur Wrestling News, Win Magazine, ... They all have different methodologies, and who's to say one is better than the other? So when I was at Intermat, I felt my rankings were probably the most well-researched. And I would always, it was as close to a poll as I could get, but it wasn't because it was, again, a ranking. I sent out a list of the top 20 per weight class with about 10 to 15 guys that could be, others looking in for discussion. And I sent them to members of the National Wrestling Media Association, which at the time I was the vice president. I am the president of it now. And we have people, and I'll say, Andy Hamilton, when he was working for the Iowa City Press Citizen, was part of that. We had a couple SIDs that really follow wrestling. We had media website people, and there wasn't as many wrestling media people then, but we had a core about 5 or 6 people that really followed wrestling, and that's what came up with the rankings, and that's why I felt like those were the best researched at the time. I also have the opinion, and I've said it on the show before, having the best rankings is like being the skinniest kid at fat camp. Yeah, so what? You're still at fat camp, As a big guy, I can say this. So the thing is, it's all about preference. There are there are schools that will use certain dual meet rankings, or they will use tournament rankings. What drives me nuts as a wrestling fan is, and I don't want to, throw Wisconsin under the bus here, but they're ranked number 4 or number 5, depending on which tournament ranking you look at. If you look at their dual meet record, they're 11-5. So logic dictates, if I say, wow, they're ranked 4th, they've got 5 losses. Well, those 5 losses aren't to the 4 teams ahead of them. They've got 5 losses. They've got losses to teams behind them and ahead of them. So I don't feel where 75% of your schedule is dual meets, give or take, you should be looking at a March tournament ranking to determine, oh, well, they're the 3rd best team in the country. In a tournament format, this is a 10 versus 10. This is not a tournament. So I always feel from a logical sports perspective that if you're wrestling a dual meet, you should use a dual meet ranking. You can say, yes, they're the, come March, they're 3rd. But I mean, Northern Iowa, I think, was ranked 3rd in the country at one point in tournament rankings at the beginning of the year. Northwestern beat them in a dual meet. Guess what? Northern Iowa they didn't drop below Northwestern. I remember last year, it was a case where Northwestern was ranked number 10th in tournament polls, and Old Dominion beat them in a dual meet. Northwestern went up in the rankings, and it was just strange because, again, those dynamics are based on the points from an individual ranking. So we've got 2 different rankings that seem to conflict with each other sometimes, and that's the frustrating part. Another thing that keeps us from having a combined ranking is some of these outlets do not want their rankings to be part of any combined rankings because they feel that the ranking is the draw to their website. The rankings is the draw to their publication. And it's print and online that are both guilty of this. And I've tried to put I've got at least some of the media talking about, yeah, we'll come together for a dual meet ranking. But right now, there's coaches polls in every sport, which some coaches are railing against coaches polls. I coordinate one. So I think there's value in a coaches poll if the coach is paying enough attention. Secondly, I mean, we just got so many different things to take in. So Penn State doesn't use a coaches poll, whereas other schools do. And it's one of those things and some of it's systematic, like the SID at Penn State. Pat Dongai is a multiple-time winner of the Publicist of the Year from the National Wrestling Media Association. They've been with Intermat since before I was with Intermat. So that's a consistency thing. They've stuck with it. That's who it is. No matter who's run the site, that's what it's been. So again, the answer is I don't feel there's a best ranking. It's all about the perspective. Secondly, when you get to the coaches panel rankings, when you've got to rank 33 in a weight class and you're looking around and what does John Smith know about Gardner Webb? What does Steve Martin at Old Dominion know about, what's going on at Oregon State? And, they've got their bubbles. They're paying attention to their conferences. And I think the bigger programs know less about the smaller programs. And every now and then you got a guy, I'll use Drew Periano as an example when he was at Northwestern. I coached with you for a little bit of Binghamton, but it's like he was a student of everything in terms of all the knowledge that he would bring him. He would email and be like, dude, here's what I got. Here's why. He would explain it. And he knew who these guys were from the smaller conferences. So it's one of those things. If you're going to use coaches, find coaches that are like that. Find people that are paying attention to everything beyond their program. And I think that's where some of the coaches panel issues lie. As we've got the qualification system coming up with the, February 27th, the RPI and the rankings all come out. We've got all of these media rankings that mean absolutely nothing to the qualification process. And then we have coaches looking at, okay, where's my guy here? Where's my guy here? And they're almost trying to like maybe say, okay, I want to be the 6 at nationals, so I'm going to vote my guy 5 because, or the other way. Well, I don't want to overrank my guy, so I'll go, I think he should be 5, but I think I'm 7 because I think it'll admit. I mean, everybody tries to game every piece of the system. It's just human nature. So
and that, ultimately, and that's my thing with
that's a lot of words there too, and I'm not even done yet.
It is with all these rankings, and when coaches are assigned to do the coaching polls, they have all these rankings have influence because these coaches are looking to cross-reference what they think is right. But when there's no standardized practice or standardized criteria from one ranking or one poll to the next, like how, I guess by proxy, by numbers, you could say, okay, if I combine all these, I can probably do a pretty good job of getting my 1 through 20. Now for me, and this is the problem with when you place coaches on these polls, once you get past 20, you're pretty much dealing with a bunch of, or close to 500 records. So now what a coach has to do, he's got to go in the OPC. If he really wants to do his due diligence and do a good job, when you're ranking, because they got to rank them all the way out to 33. When they rank all the way out to 33, you're talking about,
pain.
You're talking
painful.
Yes, you're talking not just 20 possible guys you could put in from 20 to 33. You're talking about 50. And if you're going to go through all these 50 records and go through common opponents, strength of schedule, different things that you're trying to factor in. Like, I don't know how you accurately do your job, even if you want to do it, even if you're the most well-intentioned college coach. And I was there and I tried to do a good job, JB, but I'll be the first to admit, yeah, my bias kicked in, not only for my team, but for my conference.
You're not going to rank a guy you don't know. You're not going to give a guy a favorable, okay, well, let me look at this guy from the Citadel. Should I, I haven't seen him. And then you look at, well, my kid beat that guy handily. Then you just pass him off. Whereas, again, it's familiarity. Recency bias is a term that we like to throw around here a lot in the sport of wrestling because of, everything's the latest and greatest. But, the familiarity of your opponents is also one, I guess, downfall of this system is because, what does Jim Zaleski know about Mark Cody's guys at Presbyterian? I mean, what does the new program at Little Rock? I mean, who's going to pay attention? Are the coaches up at, let's use Todd Beckerman as an example. I'm not saying he's not paying attention, but use a coach at Brown. What is the Brown coach going to know about the new program at Little Rock?
Right.
Not saying, again, Beckerman's guilty of anything. I'm just using him as an example of, where's the responsibility lie? You've got 79 teams. It's not a whole lot to keep up with because we've got, basketball's got 350 something Division I programs. And, people keep up with most of them with these bracketologies and stuff. But there's definitely a line where your familiarity becomes very, very distant. It's like, okay, I don't know anything about SIU Edwardsville. I don't know anything about Bloomsburg. So that is sometimes once you get past, the stud guy because you just peruse all the rankings and you say, Binghamton, Brown, Hofstra. It's you'll maybe recognize one guy. You're not going to recognize all 10, and that is one tough thing about this. I think the process has been a huge improvement of what it was before historical data. But again, with the coaches panel ranking playing a component to the qualification system, and a lot of that coaches panel rankings are coaches looking at the other posts going, which one do I like the best? And knowing the NCAA is never going to facilitate a media element to the qualifying process, we're just like, we've got so much, nuance with our ranking systems and so much nuance within the sport. I think one breeds the other.
So let me ask you this, and this may be a simplistic approach, JB, but NCAA is the national governing body for the sport of wrestling. Why don't they mandate how the rankings and the polling policies are set and enacted and instituted? Couldn't they do that?
Because I don't believe the NCAA actually has I mean, I could be wrong on this, but off the top of my head, I don't think the NCAA actually facilitates a ranking that is an NCAA ranking. There is a coaches panel ranking, which is the NCAA coaches panel rankings, but that's like, I think tennis has a computerized ranking. A lot of the rankings are computerized, where it's like, oh, somebody else coordinates it. The NCAA says, okay, this is our poll, or we can't use football as an example because that is a college football playoff that is not owned by the NCAA. NCAA members institutions are in there, so using that as example is gone. That's a question I have not yet asked the NCAA: is are there other polls used by the NCAA? But mandating something is different, because if you mandate something, they're going to put a computerized system onto it. And right now, what we've seen with WrestleStat, which does an ELO chess based type of thing, that's kind of cool. But you're going to look at it and be like, well, this guy is ranked below him and he just beat him. So it takes the real time, like the most recent win, you would typically jump over top of somebody, whereas computer rankings aren't necessarily going to do that. I've always been kind of infatuated with how tennis does it at the ATP level, the pro level, whereas like so and so wins this tournament, like they win like the Madrid Open or something, or insert corporate entity open in Doha, Qatar, for example, and they know they're going to win this. They're going to be number one when the rankings come out. So somebody knows that here's the formula. Here's what's going to happen if they win this tournament. They're the new world number one. Whereas you could have a world number one that's never actually won something. They could be number two, and get enough points to be world number one. So do we want that type of system? I don't know, because the head to head in our sport is something that it's like, it's simple. I beat you, I'm ranked higher than you. That's logical. Throwing in a computer system that's based on logic isn't always logical. So I think that's the devil's in the details in terms of, should we have a mandated ranking, and how do we coordinate that? Do we take an average of all the media polls? Then we have to vet the media. One thing that when I first got into the rankings game is I noticed that Intermat, for example, was based out of Iowa. Amateur Wrestling News was based out of Oklahoma. Win Magazine was also out of Iowa. And I was from the East Coast. And I'd look at these rankings, and being from a small program like Old Dominion, and we had a guy named Adam Wright, who was a national qualifier a couple times for us. Actually was a pole vault state champion, chose to wrestle in college. And he'd have good wins. But the smaller conference guys at the time on the coasts would get overlooked because they weren't constantly wrestling one another. So as, all right, Wright pops into the rankings at 20. Oh, thanks for throwing us a bone. Then he loses to a Big Ten guy, and never, a 8 to 9 Big Ten guy who is, if you're starting in a Big Ten, chances are you're pretty good anyway. And he drops out and never be seen again. So there was some of that. My friends in the East, especially in Pennsylvania, felt that was like a Midwest bias with the rankings. So then you've got regionalization with the rankings. Now we have so many. Well, we've got them all over the place. Maybe they offset. But National Mat News, which was run by Denny Deal at Lehigh, who is one of the guys who runs the Lehigh Wrestling newsletter and the AIWA newsletter for a long time with the late John Harmon, would always look at this like, well, this doesn't make sense. And Denny would call it out. And a lot of times I'd agree with him. It's like, yeah, why is, and then some of it's, again, familiarity. The Iowa locales are going to pay attention to the Big Ten, to Big 12. They know where they're at. Whereas the Easterns are going to take care of the IWA. And then basically the smaller conferences in the Southern Conference are kind of left on their own. So familiarity, how do we vet that? Who is worthy? Just because you have a website and a ranking doesn't mean you should be considered. It's like, okay, I can pop up and have rankings this week. That doesn't mean I'm a ranker. You've got some type of, I guess, track record. And maybe, I'd love to see a combined media ranking. What I do for my Mat Talk Online D1 preview guide every year is I take all the rankings, I run an average, and then also run the seed and see where they differentiate. So there is no right answer, but I would love to see a combined media ranking.
And you're one of those guys, JB, you're going to vet this process fully, right? And I think that's where it gets somewhat frustrating, is at what level are each one of these rankers actually vetting it? At what
I
point
will
are
give credit to, like, I know Flow, which has had, Piles has done them, and we had Ben Golden, and then Spay, and I believe Spay and Bracky are working on them now, and David Bray. So they've got a couple people looking at them, which is always good, a couple set of eyes. With the open mat, it was me and Eric Betterman, and we were doing it, and then Alex Steen, follow him now, Earl. So I know there's a couple people there. With amateur wrestling news, there's a couple people that involve there, because I get some of those emails, and I will kind of look at and help amateur wrestling news with a couple things, making sure that there's not an oversight. Basically, I don't really interject my opinion in a lot of these things, just making sure that you might have missed this guy, or this guy's redshirting. So they asked me to help, and I do help there. So the question is, vetting it, you're right, is, well, what makes somebody qualified to do it? That is with no blueprint, no minor leagues. I mean, I did it kind of as a result, and every website seems like they have to have rankings. So ultimately, from a team standpoint, I'd love to have a team ranking voted on by the media, maybe endorsed by the Coaches Association. Whereas the individuals, these sites want their own rank. They feel like they're the traffic, and like, well, I'm ranked by this. What I don't want to happen is what's starting to happen with sports information offices is, number 2/4/5/6/7. That's ridiculous.
yeah.
That's ridiculous. College football had that for a while with the AP and the UPI, which became the USA Today poll. So 7/2. Give me maybe two team only. If we had an individual ranking that was, the conglomerate, that would be great. Also, point of discussion. Now, I've seeded the Midlands the last couple years. I've had some input from others, but for the most part, they've said, "Hey, JB, seed the Midlands," because again, I'm unbiased in regards to, I'm not tied to a particular ranking. 90% of the time, my alma mater isn't even at the school, and I try to play things down the line. What I've done the last couple of years, I've taken the average of the 5 major rankings, 5 or 6 rankings, and put them together and ran an average and start. That was my starting point. Then I would move based on recent results, and the number of complaints has been minimal. 1 or 2 years, it's like, hey, why is this? And then ultimately, the results would take care of themselves. And I'm like, sorry, I told you so. But it's just, like you said, I pay a lot of attention to it. It's been a bane of my existence. It's been a big part of my wrestling existence. So, man, you could hear I'm just ranting about this, because I can't really wrap my head around what the right answer is, other than I would love for all of our major media outlets to come together, put their freaking egos away and their web traffic away, and say, this is for the good of the sport. Let's put one together. It's not going to happen, though.
Right, because we're all about doing what's good for the sport, and until it comes down to doing what's in our best self-interest. That's where, the problem with the sport of wrestling lies a lot of times. One of the things, as you were describing this, why there's not that much criticism when it comes to the Midlands is because any coach in the country, if they question you, you can go on a half hour tirade to rationalize, like, this is how I came up with it.
This is exactly what we're at so far. We're at a half-hour tirade here on episode 124.
Right.
But no, and here's the thing. I'm not going to say I know it off the top of my head. I've looked it up, and you know what? I have blank. There are a couple times where I did blank on a guy. There's at the Midlands, I think we had 380 wrestlers, which is bigger than the NCAA tournament. So I'm not going to say, did I look up every single wrestler? Absolutely not. There is no reason to look up some of these guys, because you just sit there. I think Piles coined a term called a Google loss at one point. And yeah, there's some guys that, I know wrestling, but I sit there and I look at the name and I don't recognize it. I don't remember seeing a result. I'm not going to look at it. A lot of times I'll go, it's the rabbit hole of track wrestling or YouTube. You know how you go to Wikipedia, next thing you know, you look up something on Wikipedia. 2 hours later, you're looking up Dr. Pimple Popper or something like that on YouTube. It's just where the world goes with that. Okay, here. Oh, well, this guy. So, those Midlands, you're only seeding top 12 to 16 anyway. So it's not like, and I blank on a guy. One year, I think I missed a win by Devin Schroeder, which affected his seed negatively. And you know what? Oh, I missed it.
But it's not.
All right.
It's not happened. It's not because you weren't doing your due diligence. You were. You just missed.
I'm not trying to screw anybody when I do that type of thing by any means.
There's always an element of human error, and that's why I think there should be a standardized computer ranking, computer poll that we say we're going off this. But I think there's enough.
If you ran a tournament and spit it out and be like, okay, what are the rankings? There's the seeds.
Yeah. But I also think we've got enough great ranking minds, if we put them together, like you said, put your egos, put your bias aside, come together collectively, take the top 5, and I think we could probably narrow that down to who are the top best ranking polling minds in the country, what they've done, and you base that on their history and longevity with doing this. Because when we pull, because you would be one of the guys, JB. I would say, okay, if there's going to be one of the guys, and again, but if I did this, what I would say, hey, I know for sure Jason has done this. One, he's got history in doing this. He's got a vetting process. He's got a standardized approach to how he feels it's important. And if you have another 4 or 5 other guys that approach it in a similar way, you could get you guys in a room and hash out like 1 through 5. What what is our rank? Like ranking's not the right word. What are our top 5 criteria when we rank, or top 10? And we're not going to deviate from this. This is how we're going to lock it in. Because right now, my problems with some of the rankings, like you said, anybody could be a ranker. Like we've talked about it at Rudis, and we're like, yeah, this would be great if we came up with our own ranking system, but what's it going to mean? How much weight is it going to carry?
Where do
I
potentially people see the conflict of interest? There's a
right.
relationship. I mean, prior to Kyle jumping to Nittany Lion, people think, well, it's an Ohio company. Kyle wrestled at Ohio State. They think there may be an Ohio State bias there. Whereas, as I mentioned, the amateur wrestling news with Oklahoma and Oklahoma State's perceived bias, or Intermat was founded by an Iowa State graduate. So there's one thing to consider there. So, back in the day, back in the 90s. So again, that regionalization things, I think when you bring them together, I think they offset, because I don't believe anybody out there is doing anything with their rankings in a nefarious nature.
No.
But again, familiarity, and there may be a bias. When I was doing the rankings at Intermat, at the time, Old Dominion was not a factor in terms of the national wrestling landscape. It was Steve Martin was in year 1 or 2. Well, they started getting better kids, and all of a sudden, I started finding myself going, "Oh crap." I'll use James Nicholson as an example. His freshman year, he's in a triangle where he beats Dave Thomasette from Hofstra twice, but he loses to Steve Middich. Thomasette beats Middich, and then there's some common opponents in there out of conference. So I'm in the situation now as going, people know I went to Old Dominion. It's like probably other than Buddy Lee, I might be the most known wrestling alum from ODU, even though I never wrestled there. But it's like looking at it going, okay, do I rank Nicholson where I think I should rank him? Or do I rank him lower because I don't want to put off the idea of bias? Because it works both ways. I don't want to look biased by putting Nicholson at 8 where I think he should. So I'm going to put him at 9, splitting the difference. And then we get to a discussion where that ranking actually mattered in the Colonial Athletic Association a couple of years ago when the CAA had wrestling, because they didn't have a set seating process. They looked at national rankings and things of that nature. It was like, well, whoa. And ultimately, in that decision, I actually put Nicholson above the triangle there because he had beaten Thomasette twice. If it was a 1-1-1, Thomasette would have gotten the nod because he had a better career, more overall wins. But ultimately, those type of situations with your alma mater or with your perceived biases can actually go the other direction. Lee Pritch used to text me all the time, "Why you lowballing our guys?" Well, I'm new in the ranking game nationally. I also don't want to make it look like, well, JB's going to rank all those Eastern guys at ODU a lot higher than they should be. That doesn't do my program as an alum any favors. If you overrank guys, you lose your credibility. If you underrank guys, you're looked at not doing your research. So again, skinniest kid at fat camp. It's a no-win sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean to your point, when you talk about the coaches poll, there's some, like you talked about, certain programs not recognizing the coaches poll because they think there's a bias from the coaches sitting on there, right?
Yeah, and they don't even, and it's not necessarily the coaches who are voting. It's who might be a board member or who might be a past president or a president elect and things like that. There's a lot of politics in wrestling that prevails in a lot of different aspects and areas.
And you're never going to remove every bias. I mean, where you live is where you live. The programs you follow is the programs you follow. You don't just independently say, hey, I want to be a wrestling ranker today. I know nothing about this sport. I have no bias. I have no rooting interest, but I want to be a ranker. Like the
So
only
where's your credibility then?
exactly, right?
So
So
it's
we have to understand that if we are going to come up with a ranking committee that don't have, and my suggestion would be no affiliations, direct, direct affiliations with any wrestling institutions. That should be a criteria.
See, that's hard because even I mean, everybody went somewhere,
No, but
whether
I'm
they
saying
were
direct
associated
in
with.
present
I mean,
day. Say,
Earl went to Mary Washington. They don't have a wrestling program, so I guess he's okay. But you know,
like for you,
it's
JB, for you, like if you were working for ODU right now, I would
if
say,
I'm like the
yeah,
director of ops or something,
yeah,
no
I would
way.
say, yeah, I probably have a problem if he's one of the official rankers, if he's on
What's
the
the difference
official
between
committee.
that? What's the difference between that and the coaches panel rankings, where you've got ADs and coaches from these schools? Granted, they
That's
have
what
to
I'm
leave the
saying. I
room.
think I think ADs, coaches, everybody should be removed from it. I don't think they've proven as much as they do a good job, and I will throw myself under the bus. And I don't think it's necessarily throwing it under the bus and saying, you know what, admitting that I don't have the capacity to do this job sufficiently well. I think every coach, if you really ask them deep down, some coaches may want to do this because they want to have influence over where their guys are ranked. Others don't. I would think the lion's share of coaches, if you put them, you know, called them on the carpet and say, hey, can you do this? Can you do your due diligence and rank these subjectively, unbiasedly, without any preference? Can you actually do it? And not only can you do it past top 20, but through the 33. And I would say the lion's share is like of coaches to say, if I could give this up and turn this over to a different committee, they would do it. So my suggestion would be remove coaches, remove ADs, remove SIDs, anybody associated with the program, because it's going to be skewed and it's going to be tainted. And I was a violator of it, JB, and I tried to do the best I possibly could. And I don't even think I did it as good a job as I possibly could.
Yeah, I mean, how many starters from I don't know, let's use Bakersfield, did you know off the top of your head when you were coaching at Binghamton?
Two.
And those are the guys you're probably ranking better than the other 8 that are you've got to at least look at. Now, one thing that you brought up is I don't think it's a great use of 5 to 6 wrestling minds times to because Mondays, here's how it typically works with most recently when I was with the Open Mat and Amateur Wrestling News is when me and Eric would put them together, we'd get all the results, we get all the records, and I was one that I started instituting the records in the rankings when I was at Intermat back in '05. So that was one thing. Again, like I put an up and a down arrow and just little visual things that kind of gave that a little bit more air of legitimacy because at the time, just like these other websites, I wanted people to come to Intermat for the rankings. So I am not um ignorant to that response or that desire to have people come to your website because they feel you have the best rankings or you feel you have the most rankings input and things of that nature. So we put them in, and then so Sunday night to Monday morning is all rank. It takes hours to do it even remotely right, and then you've got if you've got 5 or 6 minds coming together, that's 5 or 6 minds doing the exact same type of mindless it's not mindless, but I mean, it's laborious to get it all done. And then, okay, now you've wasted how many hours of how many time that those minds could be used to do something else productive for the sport. That's the one thing that I worry about is if we do it with all these people. Whereas right now, okay, they're doing their own thing anyway. What's the harm in throwing in? Okay, here's a mathematical average of these rankings. Now maybe add that as a component. But again, you get into biases. Some people believe Flow has bias towards programs that let them into their wrestling rooms more than other places. So that is a perceived bias. Again, the NCAA likely will not even include anything media because there's it's not institutional. It's an outside entity that they do not control. The extent of the NCAA's control over the media is granting credentials at the NCAA championships or regional championships and things like that. So I don't think there's a perfect solution, but I think all the time it takes to put these rankings, time and adding it up by that many people. Maybe if you take a computerized ranking and then throw the averages in there, and then we've got something. And no, is it going to be perfect? No, but at least you can say, okay, well, we know what it is. But again, the subjective nature of wrestling, this win matters more than that win. Well, he pinned him versus he beat him by decision. People look at that type of thing. I was like, well, this guy. They both have the same record. Well, he pinned him, so I'm going to rank him higher because he had the better value result. It's
And
nuts.
and that's my problem right there. It's just like that's just based off feeling. This is what I feel, not what's necessarily right or wrong. Like that's my problem with a lot of these areas when it comes down to the critical picks of who
It's hard, Matt. They're
it
not easy.
is. It
It's not
is.
hard to do, but it's hard to do right.
Yes. And that I guess I know there's enough guys in the sport that want to do it right that these individuals should be recognized, and the depth of work and the effort that they are giving to get this right, they should be recognized. Not some guy that just wants traffic driven through his website to generate numbers, right? That's not the true intent. We have individuals in this sport that are motivated, you know, by the purity of getting it right to do it right and put the efforts, and those guys should be recognized for it.
All right, what I'm going to do in the meantime is I'm going to pull up and I mentioned this earlier. Let me find my rankings page from the preview guide last year, which shameless plug will be there this year. So media rankings, where did I put it? Where did I put it? Media rankings. Media ranks. Here we go. So, for example, some of these, let me find some. I'm trying to find a weight that's got some mixing up to it. So 133 last year. Dayton Fix was the 1 seed. Misic was the 2. Suriano was the 3. Philippi was 4. So across the rankings, Dayton Fix 2 2 1 1 2 1, average of 1.5. Micic 1 1 3 2 1 4, average of 2, seed 2. So I went through, and we really didn't start getting a whole lot of mixing up until we got to Tariq Wilson, who was ranked 9th in order, but was seeded 11th, and Luke Pletcher, who was seeded 5th, but Pletcher was seeded 5th and was ranked 7th, 9th, 7th, 11th, 10th, and 12th. Now, I used Amateur Wrestling News, Flow, Intermat, the Open Mat, Track Wrestling, and Win for these averages last year. So there are situations where you get some weird outliers. It's like I'm looking for the weirdest outlier. Pletcher might be Josh Albert was average rank was 11. I threw out Amateur Wrestling News because he wasn't ranked that week because of an injury, but he was 10, 7, 8, 12, and 8, and he was seeded 4th. So, when you put those averages together, should he have been a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? Should he be a 10 seed or a 4 seed? You tell me.
10.
I mean, he was kind of injured, throughout his career, but again, not using Albert as an aberration and whatnot, but that's an example of when you put it together, you come up with an average. So
And
under
then
a
there's different
combined
things.
media average, he would have been seeded 10th.
Yeah. And there's things like with a Tariq Wilson, when you threw Tariq in there, like how much of his ranking is based upon the fact, or the benefit of the doubt is given on the fact that he was an All-American the year before. He didn't have a great year regular season, if I'm correct, right? Last year he kind of had an up and down moment.
Right.
But I think at the end of the day, when you're going back and forth, people are like, well, he was an All-American. Where me as a coach, I'm like, he was an All-American last year. This year's different, So I am not going to use that to include I'm not going to use previous information to form my present day opinion.
Well, and two, that's one thing the NCAA seeding does not include anymore. I'm going to use, let's go another example. Larry Early. Let's use the Old Dominion guy. Seeded 7th last year. Ranks 12, 9, 14, 13, 12, 10. He was seeded higher than any one of his individual rankings. So I think that's one thing that maybe the NCAA and people are like, well, this isn't even close to what we do. And then you come out with, Drew Foster was a 6 seed, 9, 10, 10, 7, 8, 11, wins a national championship. So granted, the funness of having a low seed win a championship is great. Or, Joe Smith, 33 seed, 13, 15, 13, 13, 13, 13. I mean, it's just we go so many different directions with rankings. Here we are 40 minutes in, and we don't really have there's a lot of solutions to be had. We just need to know how to ask the right question. I mean, it's just one thing that, having done rankings for over 20 years in various forms, it's nerve-wracking, and I can get on that soapbox about a dual meet ranking versus a tournament ranking. We've just been talking about the individuals. Like, Wisconsin ranked 4th in a lot of tournament points rankings. Well, they've lost 5 dual meets. They should not be 4th if they've got 5 losses. They should at least, logically, how many teams ahead of them? So that is, again, part of one of my soapboxes about using a tournament ranking to promote a dual meet. I'm at Minnesota a couple weeks ago. They're wrestling Ohio State. Minnesota's ranked, at the time, I think they were number 14 in the dual meet poll. Coaches poll, which is the one I reference all the time because it's the poll of record, because it goes back to the 60s in amateur wrestling news. But again, it says number 3 versus number 5. I mean, Minnesota's not number 5. They are in a tournament point ranking. They to promote it as 3 versus 5 looks better for TV, and it's 3 and 5, a top 5 matchup, and then you get a 3 and 5, a 35-6 with Iowa and Minnesota last weekend. I mean, is that a top 5 matchup? No, it was a 1 versus 13, and what you might expect a 1 versus 13 to look like. So I have a real issue with promoting a dual meet with tournament rankings that are March is all that matters. Well, you've got a ranking that only matters for one weekend of the year. That also is kind of a problem. But again, we get into that does dual meets matter thing, and that's another soapbox that we're going to preach on here later in the year. But it's, we have so many nuances in wrestling, and then we have so many nuances in ranking wrestling that cause all these types of discussions. I mean, I could probably talk about this for hours, but right now, I think the listeners are about to check out and be like, JB, we get it. We get it.
So I guess to wrap this up a little bit and move forward, like, what, in your opinion, what is the best entity to drive this initiative? And how do we do a better job with, because if there's anybody in this sport that has an opinion that should help drive this conversation, I think it's you. So what is the entity that would best drive this initiative, and what are your best practices to standardize it?
I think, again, back to what I said, devil's in the details with the standardization. But for years, I've tried to use the National Wrestling Media Association as kind of the unbiased vehicle. We have membership. We have membership from the NCAA. We have membership from the major wrestling publications. We have basically, we don't have a negative view from the wrestling community, because a lot of wrestling fans really don't even know the organization exists until recently, even though it's been in existence since 1987. So that would be, I guess, kind of the umbrella, so to speak. And again, full disclosure, I am the president of said association. Do not get paid by any stretch of the imagination from that association. It's strictly a volunteer thing. So I think that that's the best thing, because it's not any particular media group. We have representation from various outlets on our board too. So, or our officers. So that's the one organization I feel like could be spearheading it. But again, that needs to be it's a group effort, because everything we decide there is group. It's not like I drive everything and look for things. I make suggestions to our officers, but again, getting into how the sausage is made with that association. But that makes sense, because I've used them. I tried to use them back when I was an Intermat from 2005 to 2008. It's like, okay, to bring a media association to it, but also some of these outlets have to be members. Although I feel like it's $25 a year. It's not like, oh, well, we're trying to make money on it, but it's one of those things where be a member, and then we can have conversations about who's involved. And if it's simply an average, that's what it is. It's up to you to determine how you do your rankings. Hey, here's an average. Here's what we're going to distribute. That would be great. But we need buy-in from everybody. Every single website needs to be like, okay, you can keep your rankings. Absolutely. But if, it's weird. Like college football has their rankings until the college football playoff rankings come out. Then everybody shifts from the AP or the USA Today poll to the college football playoff ranking. It's stupid, but at least they're uniform in doing it, because no longer there's slashes. So I mean, if it comes under the Media Association banner, that would be great, because it's unbiased. It's got input from everybody that's a member, and things of that nature. So that's where I think the umbrella organization to maybe coordinate this. I've tried to poll to see if we can do something like this, but again, we'll have holdouts, and you cannot have a major player be a holdout. And that's the one thing. It's like, well, it's the media system. Well, we're not doing it. We're going to do our own thing, and here's our rankings. It's like it defeats the purpose. It's like almost like a Minority Report that just basically undermines the integrity of something else. It's like, well, your rankings they're good. They're well researched, but do you want to be a part of something that maybe this is the step one? This is okay. Now here's a uniform media ranking. Now maybe that can be introduced to the NCAA, perhaps. But until we even get everybody on board to wanting their stuff to be at least looked at fairly and adequately, I think it's just lip service right now.
I think if we standardize the practice, it's not going to be perfect. And I think if we can admit that, but it's a start in the right direction. Just like we went away from the qualification procedure, we went away from historical data to the new qualification procedure now. And I think, at that time when they implemented it and went away from historical data, the creature comforts in the person would be like, well, this is what I know and this is what I'm comfortable with. So there was a little resistance to it. And then 2 years in, they're like, this is so much better.
Oh,
And I
so
think
much better.
yeah, and I think if we could do something in that vein to the ranking system, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if it could be more uniform and standardized, people could say, "Okay, at least at least there's a general consensus of where this could go. Now let's refine it over the next couple years."
And again, there's also a situation with this just dawned on me as I'm looking at it because as we mentioned, Josh Albert, he wasn't ranked. Some rankings leave you in there for weeks at a time without wrestling. Some rankings pull you out after 2 weeks of inactivity. Some wait until they hear from the coach. And so many times I did that and be like, oh, he's come back next week. Guess what? You put him back in the rankings, they don't wrestle. Oh, he'll be back next week. Keep him in the rankings, he doesn't wrestle. And those are things that nuts. And so if you got a number one guy that comes out, do you put him back in at one after he's missed 2 months? So, and then there's also like some rankings do 20, some rankings are 25, some rankings are 33. Where do you weigh those guys that are below 20? 20 seems to be the benchmark for everybody, but where do you average? Okay, does the guy that's ranked 33rd on track wrestling get a benefit over a guy who's not ranked in track wrestling, but might be probably the 21st best guy in the country? So you get into the nuances of there's the standardization of are all rankings going to be 20 or some go 25, some go 33 because the NCAA goes 33. It's just, again, there's so many different things to try to formalize. And that's probably the hardest thing because everybody's got their own procedure. And I don't think one's better than the other. It's just a preference. So it would be cool because again, I'm gonna average the rankings like I do every year, and then this year I'm gonna actually I'm gonna throw in WrestleStat, not averaging them, but I'm gonna put their comparison to their chess ranking next to the seed as well. So we look at here's a computer ranking based on a formula that works for projecting matchups, and then here's the average, and then here's the seed, and see what the differences are. So that's one thing that there's some data points there that maybe that's something to produce and say, hey, check this out. Where can we improve?
Yeah. No, I think it's all good stuff. All interesting discussion for sure. I think it's
It's
one of those things
it's
where
also, Matt, one of the most boring discussions, but also one of the most engaging discussions too, because we're talking about subjective nuance of the sport of wrestling, which, we're not talking about takedowns. We're talking about, a lot of guys that never wrestled on that level determining. That's another thing too, is that there's some of us that I never wrestled a college match. I was on the team in high school. That's the extent of my technical actual participation on the team. So what's going to say, we're going to have somebody like, John Smith, who's won 6 World Olympic medals, looking down, be like, none of these guys put the shoes on. So what do they know? So that's
but
kind of the other drawback.
this is my problem though. But you have John Smith saying I don't really give a crap about ranking. So I'm not
True.
going to
I mean,
do it.
John's
I'm going to
bad
have
example, but using John as a name coach with credentials, I don't know his opinion on it. But again, using a name coach as an example, be like, well, what do these guys ever do? Not saying he would say that, but there's probably coaches out there be like, what do these guys ever do?
well, yeah. And I would argue the thing that I just brought up, like, I don't care what you accomplished if you're not invested in what's happening currently in the sport, and if you're not engaged in the pulse of what's going on beyond your team, whatever you accomplished in this sport, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Um,
Let's also clear up just because you've done something in the sport doesn't mean you're an expert or doesn't mean your opinion's better than anybody else's too. Because there are people out there that like to beat their chest about being a Hall of Famer and they're complete DBs.
right. And the bottom line too, JB, is like there is real life consequences to these polls. Let's not gloss over that. That's probably the one thing. Like these rankings and the coaches poll and everything, they have an effect, a real live effect on these athletes. And
And to use that CAA example again, I got a call from a coach from a CAA school who was trying to politic for their guy to be ranked higher because their seeding process was part of it was rankings. And this is before the old qualification system. So they were trying to get on one side of the bracket. So they had to beat one tough guy to make nationals instead of two. So, I mean, just there is calls, there are texts, there are, when I was doing rankings, I'd get blown up quite frequently. And don't act like coaches don't sit there and contact the ranking people to politic. That's going on behind the scenes too.
all the time, all the time. And whether you like it or not, I mean, these coaches, they're fighting for their athletes. They're doing their job.
Absolutely.
They should be doing this. If they're not doing it, if I'm the AD, I'm like, why aren't you fighting for your athletes? So I mean, I think it's a great discussion, and it's good forum
Trust the
discussion,
process.
right?
That doesn't exist.
But but I think we would be remiss not to point out, it's like there are real live implications
Mhm.
that eventually fall on these athletes. There's athletes that, hey, you got to go out and take care of your business. Don't get me wrong. You got to go perform when you're inside that circle. But you know what? Like it or not, there's some kids are on the outside looking in, and other kids are on the podium based upon where their rank and correspondingly their seeding falls at the NCAA tournament.
Very true. And I want to shift gears just a moment to the team rankings situation where I've tried to get perhaps the media association or media members to do a media poll that's endorsed by the coaches association. So maybe, one of those things we're still conducting it the same manner, just using a different methodology of how to vote. And my pitch was here's how these AP sports writers are actually saying, here are my votes this week on Twitter. Those outlets here's how we voted, and they can get content out of it. That's one thing I like about the possibility of saying, hey, I'll use Flo as an example. Hey, Flo likes to throw all sorts of content out there of various degrees of success. And, they throw a lot of spaghetti to the wall and see what sticks, and what sticks, they repeat. And it's like, hey, here's how we voted this week in the coaches poll. That to me would be dynamite content. Same for Win Magazine. Same with the Open Mat. Like, here's how we voted this week. And this is, and you can, it doesn't really segment it, but like, hey, here's how we voted. And that is a cool thing that I think could be implemented as a way. It's like, okay, now we have a team poll that's utilized and uniform. That way we don't have number 4/number 12 Wisconsin this week.
Right. No, I agree. It's all, you know, we may be thinking this is mindless discussion, but I find this stuff fascinating.
I just wonder how many people actually care, honestly, because there's a portion of us that when they see a rankings discussion, they skip the page. And then there's people that just get into it and it could be a 15-page thread on the mat.com or a one-page thread on Twitter that nobody's reading. It's weird. Sometimes you catch people on the right days and you ask the right questions. And I don't know. I mean, having done rankings for so long, I mean, for a while they were like, like I said, when I was with Tom and the Open Mat, the Open Mat Amateur Wrestling News together, Mondays were brutal. Like, it was like, oh, I got to do the rankings, and I'd be just you just sit there and you look at it. It's like, okay, and then you look up the records, and just it's a discussion that people are very, very passionate about, especially when they do rankings. And I said, I don't want to down talk anybody's rankings, but yeah, there are some rankings out there that I feel like do a better job of the research, but maybe their end product isn't what I would agree with. And it's not directed at any specific entity. It's just, I think you can apply that to everything. It's like, I see these no, don't like that. And I like that. And then from weight to weight, it's different. So
yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, JB, where people say, I don't really care about rankings until they look at a ranking and then they have an opinion.
And what happens? What's the most overstated phrase in wrestling is, what a joke. Everything's a joke. What a joke. Well, somebody gets a 5 seed that should be seeded 10th. What a joke. What a sham. NCAA is corrupt.
Yeah. Well,
another soapbox with
exactly
fan reactions there too.
Yeah.
So, wow, we didn't talk about a single bout this week on this episode, but what we do in talking about rankings, and I'm going to use the coaches poll for these rankings again this week. Northern Iowa was at Wisconsin on Thursday, Arizona State at Lehigh on Friday, along with Nebraska and Minnesota. I'll be on date night, so I will not be at the Sports Pavilion that night. So I'm actually missing a home Gopher duel. Friday, that's the match. Saturday, Iowa State at Missouri. We've already heard that it was put out there on Twitter. I think Cody Goodwin put it out there that Dresser is not going to be wrestling a lot of his, not a lot, but a couple starters are going to go to get some matches to try to build that RPI up in coaches rank at this point in the year. We've also got Virginia Tech and Pitt, another top 10 match in the ACC. This is something that we've seen for the last 4 or 5 weeks, top 10 matches in the ACC. And the season finale, the 23rd, Arizona State at North Carolina, Rutgers at Princeton, and Oklahoma State at Iowa, closing out the year. So that's the weekend on tap, Matt. What are you most excited to see?
I mean, all of it. I mean, one thing that I found fascinating, and it wasn't one specific, but it's interesting to see the high level quality opponents facing each other the last week of the regular season. Typically, if it's not, and I know some of these are conference duels, some of these programs are still finishing up their
those 3
schedule.
that I pointed out on Sunday, Pac-12, ACC, EIWA, Big 10, Big 10, Big 12.
But that was my thing. Like, I was surprised when I looked at this week's schedule, like the out of the highly ranked out of conference opponents that are facing each other this weekend. And it's always fascinating for me to think about how a coach is approaching, how he wants to transition into the postseason. Do you want a really tough battle? Do you want to get some momentum? Because I'm looking like a Penn State has an American, right? And so they're obviously probably going to maybe win all 10, maybe win 8, 9, but it looks like for Penn State, they want the approach like, hey, let's get momentum. Let's feel good. Let's put points on the board, as we transition. Then we see an Arizona State versus UNC is like 2 top 10 opponents, before their conference tournament. And so it's interesting for me just to see how coaches approach their schedule as it pertains to the postseason.
Is it get momentum, or remember Penn State lost Suriano with the National Duels Bowl series down at Oklahoma State? So some schools they don't want to replicate that? A guy gets hurt in a high level match. Granted, I think people have a better chance of getting hurt in practice more than they do a high level match, but that's another discussion entirely. But again, looking at it, it's weird because while it was one of the knocks on the National Duels was too many tough matches going into the postseason, and then that bowl series lasted a year or two, and it was just like, well, now we're seeing like, well, wait, Oklahoma State's wrestling Iowa the last day of the regular season. And it's like, well, while the format didn't stick, it seems like some of the methodology did with some of the coaches. So again, for every injury like a Suriano we had in Stillwater that day, we've got 3 non-conference top 25 dual meets on the last day of the regular season. So I don't know. Sometimes I don't know how to read what people want. I mean, if there's that book, What Women Want, well, what do wrestling coaches want? I want to read that book.
Well, it's hard to get a consistent answer when the answer always changes from year to year based upon the team that you have and how it fits into the format of the national dual schedule and this. So they conveniently, we're great at this as wrestling coaches, conveniently changing our position.
If we had goalposts, we'd move them frequently. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's where we end up. So Matt, next week we're going to have the regular season done. We're going to have the qualifier allocations coming out February 27th. So we've got the RPI, the coaches panel rankings, and then we've got what was the third one? The coaches rank the record, and the RPI will all factor into the allocations on the 27th. Conference weekend coming up the first weekend of March, along with the NAIA championships and the NJCAA championships. D2 and D3 the following weekend before we cap off college wrestling season, third weekend of March here in Minnesota. So, oh boy, be glued to the couch this weekend, getting things ready, Matt. It's going to be a good finale. It's
going to be great, JB. Appreciate the conversation and looking forward to catching up next week.
So for Matt Dernlan, this is Jason Bryant. You've been listening to episode 124 of the Rudis Wrestling Podcast.